I just want to, jump right in and let you know that some of the things that we are going to be talking about today with perfectionism, you may have heard before, and some of them, they may be new for you. But either way, I want you to just, take what works for you and feel free to, discard the rest. But even if you have heard these things, some of them before, sometimes it's helpful just to hear them in a fresh day, in a different voice, and to give yourself a chance, to be exposed to the material. So I just hope that, if you are a perfectionist and you're watching this, and you might say to yourself, oh, I've done that before, I've heard that tip before, why am I not doing it perfectly? Try to give yourself a little latitude and understand that when we're trying to build new habits or try new things, especially when we're dealing with some ingrained patterns, sometimes it takes hearing the material a few times and letting it sink in on different days. So I encourage you to be a little bit patient with yourself. Now, let's just talk for a moment here about the concept of perfectionism. I mean, what is it really? Obviously, it's an emphasis on wanting to do things perfectly, to the point where it can almost become a little irrational or have some intense self-criticism. But a lot of perfectionists kind of secretly feel like, well, so what? I'm willing to tolerate some intense, criticism if it helps me to, carve out my spot of excellence in the world. And, it's a price I'm willing to pay. And I can understand that to a degree. And that's why it's important, though, to understand that while, we might be sitting here focusing on cutting that one little blade of grass so perfectly, what often happens with perfectionism, and we'll get into the whys a little bit more as the presentation goes on, some of the things that happen with your brain and your emotions, but oftentimes that really intense emphasis on doing one thing perfectly ends up costing us more in the long run, to the point where strategically we actually don't even end up achieving as much and learning as much than if we were not carrying that burden of perfectionism. So it's almost like a misnomer, right? That we call it perfectionism, and yet it ironically actually presents a barrier to us having, our most optimal achievement. So I'm just mentioning that here because I want to increase your motivation to learn this material. And so, again, if there's a part of you that's saying, well, I like being perfect, I want you to remember that oftentimes, perfectionism actually leads to more problems than it solves. So let's just take a quick moment as well and think about some of the origins of perfectionism. Whenever we're thinking about changing something or revising something in ourselves, it's good to understand, what purpose it may have served at one point in time in our lives, or where it came from. So the thing here, the reason I have a picture of this little girl at the dentist, is because children often have kind of a black and white perception of the world, right? Either you go to the dentist and you can just get no cavities, right? It's kind of a black and white hurdles that they face. You can learn to tie your shoes. You can learn to spell all the words on the spelling bee list or things like that. And for kids, it actually is often desirable, for them to just completely master these skills. And they get a lot of praise for doing that. So they can kind of then carry that expectation or that template with them into their adult lives. And so what worked as a child may not always, be what's going to work for you necessarily as an adult as well. But also, again, about this origins of perfectionism, it's also possible that some of us had a parent that was a little bit overbearing, and it was kind of annoying at the time. But then it's almost like in psychology, we call it an introject, where that person just almost forms inside of your head, and you can kind of almost hear, your, critical mother or whatever kind of yapping in your mind. So that's another way that we can get that sometimes in our head. But it's important, though, to understand that we may even have internalized the idea that there was actually some value to that approach. So we might even end up saying, yeah, my mom was super overbearing, but I did really always do well in school. And so maybe there was a trade-off there. I want to point out the fallacy in that thinking, right? Because what you would be doing in that setup for yourself is you would almost be pitting that scenario of an overbearing, really critical and harsh parent or inner critic against the idea of a parent that's going to be totally absent, not providing any structure or any feedback. So I just wanted to take a moment and look at the way that perfectionism can sometimes seep its way into our adult life, because it did that when we were children before we really had a chance to use our adult brain to stop and think about it a little bit. Another reason that we need to think a little bit about the origins is because we develop what are called cognitive habits, right? They're basically like heuristics or shortcuts or just styles that we have used in our life of things that have worked for us. And it's entirely possible that when you were a preteen, you may have needed a little bit more of an iron fist to just kind of lay down the law and focus you. Because kids and youth, of course, they have these raging hormones. They also have what we call an immature prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, I'm pointing at my head here because that's where it is. It's the part of your brain that thinks about future consequences. It's the part of your brain that serves to help you focus your attention and concentration. That part isn't fully developed in preteens. It's not even fully developed until about age 25. So again, it's entirely possible that you might be using tools of managing yourself that were actually good tools for a teen or a young adult, but that now at this point in your life, if you're continuing to use those same kind of blunt instruments, you end up kind of depleting yourself, right? Because if you now, with your mature prefrontal cortex, you already understand the concept of future consequences, you can focus yourself, within reasonable limits. And if you just end up using that iron fist, that overkill tool, it actually ends up becoming counterproductive, right? You can see just kind of this picture here. This looks like a person who's just been kind of bulldozed by his inner critic to the point where he's starting to lose motivation and engagement and willingness, to keep going. He's not bringing a lot of fire that we actually need because his inner critic may be using the tools that were helpful for him at 17 or 18 when he needed to focus and study, to get a good test score. But at this point in life, those tools are no longer serving him. Now, what I'm saying might make you think to yourself, oh, I'm just going to get rid of my perfectionist then, my inner perfectionist. I drunk the Kool-Aid, Dr. Chloe. I'm totally into it. Let's get rid of that perfectionist, right? And then ironically, we can almost become a perfectionist about wanting to get rid of our perfectionist. And I'll tell you that when we want to get rid of a part of ourselves, it's usually just ends up putting us at war with ourselves, because there is some value to that part of you. It was there for a reason. It was helping you in some way. So if we try to say, I'm just going to get rid of that perfectionist, then what can almost happen is that there becomes like a secret resistance inside of you that says, no, I'm gonna stay on that perfection. And then we just end up kind of divided against ourselves. So rather than trying to get rid of your perfectionist, I would like to see if we can actually try to befriend it. Because when we try to shout it down, we end up at war with ourselves. So one of the things that we might want to do is recognize that the perfectionist and our, regular actual self have the same goals. They actually normally have the same goals. Whether it be excellence or, feeling like through people pleasing that we can earn love and acceptance, they have the same goals. And so if we can actually start by starting a dialogue with that inner perfectionist and saying, some of the things that you want, most of the things I actually want too. And what we're going to be doing here today, inner perfectionist, is actually offering you some better tools to be more effective at what you want, which is a drive to excellence, or having great relationships, or whatever it is that perfectionist is after. We don't want to make it feel scolded or like it's lost in argument or something like that. We want to actually invite it to the table and say, yeah, we get it, like those are healthy goals. We just want to come up with a better way of doing it. And so that's why you'll notice that some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, some of them are like techniques, like step by step, do this, and do that. But some of them are more about our perspective and our inner dialogue and the way that we're thinking about that part of ourselves. So let's then just, ask that question, of course, what does the inner perfectionist want? Typically, of course, it wants to do really well and to be liked by others, and those things are well and good. It's important to let our inner perfectionists know that the tweaks that we're going to make here today are not about derailing our efforts to do very well in life, to in fact reach our full maximal potential in life, and to be very well liked by others and to have great relationships. I want to let that inner perfectionist know that we're working on the same goals here. I actually want to harness your inner perfectionist and see if I can get your inner perfectionist on the same team here, because that inner perfectionist probably has some good qualities. Maybe it's very high in conscientiousness and making sure it follows through, right? So I want to see if we can get that perfectionist just simply on board, but pointed in the right direction. Because what can happen now without any management is that inner perfectionist sometimes just wants to only focus on the negatives, because they feel like focusing on the positives could make us really complacent, and that our best efforts are really just spent focusing on the areas of improvement, for areas for improvement. Now that sounds good and logical, and again, I just want to underline that there's a lot of value in being willing to take a hard look at yourself and be the first person to spot the issues, and being willing to work on them. We're not trying to get rid of that at all. We're just trying to add something to it, which is some knowledge that by training ourselves to just focus on the negatives, we could actually be setting ourselves up for depression and anxiety. And ironically, depression and anxiety have symptoms like lethargy, low energy, lack of engagement, irritability, preoccupation, all of the things, again, that ironically and kind of cruel twist of fate way end up getting in the way of the very things that perfectionist wanted. And so in psychology, when a person focuses primarily on the negative things too much for too often, they experience what psychologists call cognitive dampening. And what that means is that they actually start to, I don't want to say lose, because that sounds permanent. The good news is it's not permanent, but that they temporarily lose their ability to actually see and notice the positives. Now, how can we offset cognitive dampening, you might ask? The way to offset cognitive dampening would be to actually take what we call in psychology an opposite action, right? So if the cognitive dampening action is that you're focusing on negativity to the point where it's almost automatic, and you're starting to not even really register some of the positive events, I would suggest taking 5 minutes, and for those 5 minutes only, just deliberately focusing 100% only on the positives. Now, I can hear some of your inner critics, kind of rolling their eyes and saying, but wait a minute, I don't want to just be a Pollyanna, just, idiotically only giving myself happy talk. I need to solve problems. And so just focusing on the positive isn't going to help me. And I would agree with you. And that's why I want to just highlight that this is different from just simply saying, well, I'm just going to focus on the positive, right? This is